Thank you for that introduction. It's certainly a pleasure to be here. I traveled from Cincinnati, Ohio, on, what day did I leave there? Thursday, to arrive here on Saturday night. And I just was thinking that I have seen the longest day of the year for sunshine and the shortest day of the year for sunshine in a matter of 2 or 3 days. So it's a pleasure to take part in your program this morning. It was very interesting. Last week I was with the food and drug officials of the United States, which are the state and federal food regulatory agencies, and we were talking about some of the same subject matter. I thought 50 years of food safety. I remember my first day. I was a trainee on a training program, and I was about a third through this because my background is in meat science. And so I'm at the retail level looking at doing things in meat. And so it was a Friday afternoon, and the supervisor came by and said, "You're to be in the president's office at 8 a.m. on Monday morning." And I looked at him and I started laughing. And I said, "This is some joke." And he said, "No, this is for real, and you better be there or I'm in trouble and you'll be in worse trouble." Because I anticipated getting up there at 8 a.m. in the morning, and who did you want to see? But I met with the president at 8 a.m. on that particular morning, and he said, "We want to do something in food safety." Now get this is 1966, 1967, excuse me. And he said, "You're it. There's your desk. You start today. You use my secretary until we figure out where we're going here." And then he gave me a file folder. And he said, "Here's everything I know about the subject matter." So I opened up that file folder, and there was a pink slip in there. While you were gone, somebody called type thing. But the best part was there was a dirty napkin, bar napkin there with a drink stain on it. And there was writing on every square of that particular note. Little did I know that became my job description for 50 years. And so it was fun getting into the particular field and learning some new things. I suddenly realized on that very first day I was a pioneer because we didn't even know what food safety was back in those days as we know it today. And it was basically in sanitation area. This morning we're talking about microbiology that you can't see, but you better believe. And back in those days, we could see problems. We didn't need a microscope. But it was on September 18th. I remember that day well as I went back to my desk, looking at this file folder, and food safety. What is it? Where do I start? And he said, "We've ordered a big book for you." And it was about this thick. And it was for a regulatory sanitarian back in those days. And so I had a chance to look at that big book. But about 10 o'clock in the morning, somebody came by and says, "Join us for coffee." So I had coffee with the folks. And from there on out, I was busy on a number of things. But one of the things that drove the particular decision was something called milk powder and something called salmonella. This is the headline from the Milwaukee Journal in 1966 when there was a major recall in the United States because somebody was ill from salmonella and infant formula. But in the retail operations where I started out at, I was involved in what are we doing in the retail stores as far as sanitation was concerned. Back in those days, we had a fresh meat operation where all of the cutting and dicing and other things were done in the meat department. All of the lunch meat at that particular time came in prepackaged. And then you had fresh produce out on the rack that had come right out of the field with dirt on it. In the processing area, I guess I could say we had rotisserie chickens, which were heated and cooked in the store for consumer consumption. But, you know, going back, this was before we even talked about ready-to-eat foods. That was the closest thing we came to. But then you think back, that was before the microwave oven was even invented, that I was involved in food safety, and certainly prior to the internet. With my background in meats, I was dealing with hanging meat in the store that you would bring in a quarter of a beef on your shoulder, totally unwrapped, put it on a hook, and then you would cut it up and package it in the retail store. Back in those days, they used sawdust on the floor because of the drippage and fat that would accumulate for food safety. And then we had wooden, hard maple top tables that were cutting tables, no plastic, very difficult to clean. Products had a short shelf life, and there's enough competitive microorganisms back in those days. We didn't even talk about E. coli or salmonella. And you were dealing with raw chicken and everything else, but nobody really talked about micro. So at that point, there was a lot of cooking by the consumer of the particular product from the raw state, and that was one of our saving graces. Back in those days, the temperature requirements was 40 degrees for hot foods, 45 degrees for cold food. But now we know that those temperatures are not adequate to reduce the growth of the challenging pathogens. Chemical sanitizer were basically Clorox or chlorine used in the store. But then in the 70s, shortly thereafter, life changed as we had some problems. There's a big soup company in the New York area that was producing canned soup, and they had an outbreak of botulism. Food warehouses, pest problems, rodents, insects. There we were dealing with macro things that you could see, you could address. Then came along a rail car sanitation problem with deaths of a number of dogs because the rail car had been previously used to transport a toxic material called lead oxide. And then the regulatory agency decided that transportation was no more than a warehouse on wheels, and so they had some pretty serious concerns about how we're removing food. Then the canned mushroom issue came along and looked at swollen cans of mushrooms where they had overpacked the mushrooms and also resulted in some botulism issues related to mushrooms and also canned chili. And then there was a problem with smoked fish, again, botulisms because of problems with temperature control. Out of that, the industry was working together and putting together guidelines, but we got more than guidelines as we got regulations on low-acid canned foods in the United States because of this particular problem. And then good manufacturing practices were proposed by the regulatory agencies in the early 70s, but because of dirty warehouses, the regulatory agency started prosecuting company officials. And I have a little homework assignment for you folks that when you go home, do a search on the term the Park Doctrine. This was a Supreme Court case in the United States that allowed the FDA to hold the chief executive officer responsible for any food safety problems. And they used that case for several years, and then it kind of quieted down. And in recent years, with some food safety issues, it has resurfaced and is being used for prosecution. In the 1980s was a new learning curve, starting out with product tampering as it related to a over-the-counter painkiller called Tylenol, and introduced me to a new science called forensic science. And then we had copycats form out of an incident of glass being found in baby food. And we actually had mothers that took glass and actually cut the tongue of a baby and took it into the hospital and emergency room and asked for treatment. She finally confessed that she had taken the glass and cut the baby's tongue in order to get attention. There were about 140 of those cases scattered all over the United States in a copycat manner. And so now I've been introduced to a forensic chemist, a forensic pathologist, and also a profiler. As you get a letter and you try to evaluate, does this individual mean that he will carry through, etc. And so tampering and was a big issue. There was an act passed by Congress, probably one of the quickest ones we've ever had in the U.S. And there are 4 points in that product tampering case. It's against the law to file a false complaint. It's against the law to actually do the tampering. And it's against the law to actually tamper with the product itself. And then it also includes the labeling as the 4th point. And there have been many people prosecuted in the U.S. because of that. And so it was a new wave back in those days. And you see some of these things reappearing in time to follow. Then there was a big problem in a milk plant in Chicago where one day there was 220,000 people ill because of a production lot out of that particular plant. And that changed the dairy industry in the U.S. because of that particular issue. We were in discussions with FDA on closing out that particular issue, and the phone rang, and the chief of the milk safety branch of USDA, or of FDA, hung up, and he says, "Do you know anything about listeria?" And he said, "We've got 52 deaths that have been identified in Los Angeles associated with some soft cheese." And so that was an introduction to listeria. And so that caused a lot of attention in dairy plants throughout the country as we looked at procedures being followed, as we looked at processing times, temperatures, as we looked at equipment. And I so happened to have in the Kroger company the plant that was built by the same architect as the one that the problem was in. So I got a telephone call from the regulatory agency that they wanted to use my plant for training purposes. And they would have all 52 milk specialists who look after the dairy industry in the United States spend 2 weeks in this particular plant. And so I thought, well, I better talk to the boss. So I explained to the boss what had been asked, and he said, "I think it's a good idea, and you're in charge." So then I had to talk to the plant manager and get his permission as well, and he too thought it was a good idea, and in the end it was an excellent training experience for all of us. And we shared that information throughout. Environmental controls came to about in the 80s as we started looking for salmonella and listeria in various plants. Then in the 90s, we were involved with E. coli 0157 being declared as an adulterant in ground beef. And that involved sampling a lot of ground beef and setting up programs to address the meat requirements. Then the next thing we had was 015787 in apple juice that was being put together on farm for consumers to drink when they were out harvesting apples, but it got into some of the major bottlers of apple juice, and that caused a severe problem with some people ill and some deaths. Then come along listeria in hot dogs. That involved about 125 people becoming ill from eating hot dogs, with about 30 deaths. And that caused the lunch meat and the meat processors who package lunch and meat certainly to step up and start looking very carefully at the way they handle hot dog production. Then there was Staphylococcus enterotoxin in canned mushrooms from China, and they were being imported into the U.S. to where we had to test every lot of mushrooms coming into the U.S. from China because of the toxin formation in the mushrooms in the communities in China and the way they were handling them. Then we go on from there with some other food safety issues that got attention. Again, lunch meat, but the spinach outbreak changed the produce industry, with 015787 being identified in spinach. We had a consumer in Albuquerque, New Mexico, who had thought she had purchased that spinach, so I had to take her shopper card information with her permission and identify what lots of spinach were in the store where she allegedly had purchased it in the display case when she was there on that day. And then I tracked that back to the warehouse where it came from, back to the distribution point of the grower or the processor, who went back to the grower and back to the field where it was harvested. And we were able to do that in about an hour and a half. Then there was another outbreak that caused us to relook at the canned food regulations as it related to canned chili. But ground beef continued to be a sore spot to look at as we looked at E. coli. Sprouts, constant problem related to seed, what was inside of the seed. Listeria in cantaloupe. I have a situation where farmers were told to wash their cantaloupe. They harvested them, washed them, did not have a sanitizer in the water that was effective enough. They packed the wet melons into cardboard cases that were stored in a cooler without adequate refrigeration and air movement. So we had a nice incubator. Those were distributed out, and there were 30-some people that had died because of that particular situation. So there was changes in the way we harvest cantaloupe. Now come along economic adulterations. There's been a constant problem with the juice industry, with the honey industry, and with other syrups that we'd been dealing with over the years. And actually it set up a testing program on authenticity of these various products. And this is an ongoing authenticity program looking at a sampling of different types of food subject to that activity. But the pet food with melamine was an eye-opener. It certainly brought a lot of attention to the pet food industry, but it brought even more attention to food safety of human foods as we move forward out of that particular issue. I was on the board of directors of the company that had the problem after the fact as we looked at other ways of addressing that in the future. Threats and extortion with the climate in the world these days. This is an area that many companies have not really addressed well, as they need procedures to follow if they get these particular types of communications. So something else to worry about as we deal with issues of food safety. We also have the Centers of Disease Control in the U.S., and they were good at finding church picnic problems, but with newer technology and epidemiology, it certainly gave them the ability to look at multi-state outbreaks that they were able to identify and do investigations on, and resulted in product recalls. But what did the recalls tell us? We look at the trend line. The world changed in 2007 as we look at recalls. No matter what part of the world that you're looking at, you will see a similar change in the number of recalls or number of products being removed out of the marketplace. This happens to be a little trend in the last 4 years that I saw in New Zealand as I look at some of the worldwide data in various forums. Major contributing factors to our recalls that I see is a failure to maintain food processing facilities and equipment, to where you have niches in there that are causing contamination or failures in food safety, and non-compliance with general good manufacturing practices that were established in 1970 that's still a problem today. But looking at the inspection reports for 2018 for the FDA and looking at plants, the number one problem is monitoring the sanitation in the plant. Pest control comes number two. Process controls being inadequate is the number three. And just plain plant maintenance. I don't know how many recalls I can contribute back to roof leaks in a food manufacturing plant. But personnel practices in general, hands and movement of people in the plant are very critical things that are contributing to recalls and spreading contamination throughout the plant. Equipment design and maintenance, again, is a problem. There's a lot of attention in the U.S. on sanitary design of equipment and also of plants. And they're making some progress, but there's a long ways to go as you look at some of those things. FSMA has brought about the HACCP plan that has to be in place, and the hazard analysis and the new Food Safety Modernization Act is now in force and being inspected it will be inspected if there's an outbreak, but the routine inspections are also taking place. And sanitation of food contact surface has been a big concern. What's the consumer's reaction to recalls? Well, initially you may see about 75% drop in your sales. And I keep asking the marketing people, do you have that in your budget? If you don't spend money to fix it up, do you have the losses in your budget? But the consumer research that I've seen on that particular subject matter, you see in 2007, there's a 38% drop. That was not a good year in food safety in the US, but you will see that it carries over with 26% of that particular commodity. It's not just that brand, it's the commodity that takes the hit. And I work for some good bosses that says, if somebody else has a problem, it affects us. We had 42 food manufacturing plants in Kroger, plus 2,500 retail stores. And so that certainly was an impact to our particular business. But the biggest driving force of all is the evolution of epidemiology. And as we discussed this morning, whole genome sequencing certainly can pinpoint a lot of problems before an illness outbreak as we know them in the past. You're going to be on the upside where you're going to reduce the number of people involved, but it will certainly identify a common product. For example, yesterday there was a notice put out for people eating papayas imported from Mexico, and it was limited to a few northeastern states in the United States where the papaya had been shipped to. It's a salmonella contamination issue and something they were zeroing in on. But it can identify the product, identify the company, it can identify an ingredient when used properly, and or even a place on a piece of process equipment. So wow, it's certainly the whole genome sequence that puts us into the fast lane with many opportunities ahead as we deal with food safety issues. It's really a partnership, and everybody in the food chain needs to be involved in food safety from the seed to the table as we look at food safety. Because we have to meet the consumer expectation with every package that we send out of a food manufacturing plant or even put together in a retail store. It's a very important aspect of our business. Thank you for your attention.